Hey guys, are you ready for the third installment of my Punishing Dumbass Openings series? This is a game I just played and I just thought I had to share it with you. Hopefully, if you've been watching my videos, you will have a good idea of opening principles and the right and the wrong pawns to move in particular. So let's just dive straight into this game. You can see here from the game analysis that it was pretty one-sided, and in fact that's how the game turned out. So without further ado, let's dive in and check out a brand new, completely dumbass opening. So I start with e4. My opponent plays g6. Now this is perfectly normal. This is a modern defense. So now you would expect bishop to g7, maybe knight to f6. Sometimes one of these pawns will come out. I think the d pawn can prevent e5 so that the knight can go here without being troubled. But that is not what my opponent played. So I figure let's grab the center while the opportunity is there and see what my opponent does. So I'm very much expecting bishop to g7, but he doesn't play that. He plays f6. Sorry, yeah, f6. Now, I don't know if I've ever seen this before in my life. So I actually thought for half a minute at this point. This is a 30-minute rapid game. So I bring out my bishop where there's a bit of a nice diagonal going on. Really not sure what my opponent's idea is. I mean, this knight now can't come out to f6. If he fianchettos this bishop, where's the knight going to go? Is it going to go to there? Is he really going to castle and put his king on here, on this diagonal? I just don't know. But bringing the bishop out seems to be a sensible move. And now we have c6. Okay, so he seems to be making... He's got kind of a bit of control, I guess, over the center squares. So I now play c3. The engine said knight to c3 would be better. Maybe it would, but this allows my queen to come out with ideas of putting my bishop here on f7, and that would actually be checkmate if I can get that. So that would be a stunning checkmate. Black prevents this with the move d5. Now we have captures and captures, and I drop my bishop back to b3. So where's this king going to go? Is it going to go to here, or is it going to go to here? I mean, clearly c8 is just horrible, but g8 doesn't look much better. So where's he going to castle? And now we have a truly dumbass move, because on the previous move, if you see, the queen is the only defender of this advanced pawn on d5, and by putting his bishop on d7, my opponent blocks the defense of d5 and allows me simply to grab the pawn. So now my bishop's looking at this pawn and maybe with ideas of capturing the rook as well. So black now throws in an attack against my queen with a discovered attack on the bishop, and this seems very sensible. Now I've got a couple of options here. I mean, I could have simply drop my bishop back to here, and if takes, I can capture with a knight and go ahead and castle. That would be absolutely fine. But I figure that simply moving my queen out now to b3, it's developing a piece. So better than retreating, much better idea to bring a piece out. And now again, I'm threatening to put my bishop on there. That would force the king out to d7, and things could get very uncomfortable from that point. So black now pushes yet another pawn and puts it on e6 to hit my bishop. I simply capture, bishop captures, queen captures, and there are not many options now. So black now plays queen e7. Now what I would love to do would be to put my queen here on c8 with check, which would force the queen to come back. I take, and then the king has no castling rights, but I can't do that because my queen's actually pinned against my king. So exchange of queens is now forced. So at this point, if you evaluate the board, I've got no pieces out in the board. Black only has this one knight that's developed. The king is still in a rather awkward position and is not looking like castling anytime soon. So I develop my knight preparing to castle myself. Knight comes in. There's no real attack, no real massive threat here, so I simply castle. And black now develops his other knight, and I decide to slide my rook over to the completely open e file. That comes with check. Also notice now that material is more or less equal, except for the fact that I have these two pawns on the c file and the d file. Those pawns are off the mark. They're starting to come out into the board, and this pawn on d4 in particular could have an unopposed romp all the way to promotion at the other side. So now pragmatic chess might dictate that you simply just need to simplify, swap off material, and then use this two-pawn advantage to convert the game. So the king now moves out into the centre of the board. It might as well. There's no real safety to be found on the back rank. And now I decide to bring out my last knight. Obviously it can't go to c3, so I'm thinking of bringing it to one of these squares where it can hopefully put pressure on that king. Bishop comes out now to d6, and I attack the bishop with my knight. Knight comes back to counterattack my knight, and I simply swap off the bishop, bringing the king further into the middle of the board. Now bishop f4 comes with check. The king has to retreat. And these two knights side by side are actually covering quite a lot of squares between them. So this is a pretty good setup for knights. They like to have that. Yeah, so if you look at this, not that one, but they are covering, yeah, that one. They are covering quite a few squares there between them. So black now probably wants to get his rook out and probably hide his king away there on the queen side. So I push b3 now, and that takes away these two squares from the knights. Knight now comes to d5, where it's actually attacking both my bishop and this pawn, so I drop my bishop back to d2, saving itself and also defending the pawn. We have a pawn push up now on the king side, and I decide to hit the knight. Knight comes to here, and I've got a serious question now, big decision. Do I swap off the knight and double these pawns, leaving isolated pawns, or do I retain my bishop, which is obviously a long-range piece and could come in handy in the endgame? So I decide instead just to advance d5. It is generally a good idea to compound the pressure when you've got unopposed pawns, like passed pawns. Every step that they can take towards promotion at the other end of the board just adds a little bit of pressure to your opponent. And now we have knight back to e7, and I attack this pawn and of course the rook that's behind it as well. Pawn's currently undefended, so the rook comes across to defend. Now I attack the knight, which has obviously the rook behind it. Rook moves to defend the knight, and I decide now to swap off material because it's time to just consolidate my advantage. I've still got these two wonderful pawns that have made good progress up the board. My king is pretty safe. I've got a rook on the back rank. What's not to like? So we have now knight to d4 and some counterplay up the king side. I hit the knight now. I'm expecting the knight to come to here, in which case I just slide my king into g2. Now, one thing to remember, particularly when you get into end games, is that if you can get your king in behind like a pyramid or even a diamond of pawns, then when you've got a knight out that could be an attacking piece, having your king here means that the squares where the knight might check your king are all guarded by pawns. Okay, so I figure that's a good idea. Knight comes back round, maybe half attacking f2. I hit the knight retreats, and now I pin the knight with my rook. King moves out of the way to break the pin, and I just drop my king into g2. So it's nice and safe in there. We now have h4, and I advance my rook. And now this is a check from the pawn, which I kind of anticipated. I just put my king back on f1. So I figured that f1 is a bit better than g1. just in case this rook has any ideas of coming across and then down here to try and check my king. Then my king is now guarding these key squares. King moves, and now I advance f4. Pawn takes, and now rook takes. Rook comes back to comes up to h5, and I've got a few ideas here. I did think about well, there's going to be possibilities of maybe checks, but I figured that putting my knight here, this is now going to prevent this rook from coming to this square, and I just like the look of that move. Now the knight moves, and I bring my rook back to attack the knight. Knight comes back to the back rank. This knight is now actually trappable to a degree. If I put my rook here, for example, it's covering these squares, and this square is obviously covered by the pawn, so the knight could actually be trapped there. But the problem with this move, of course, is, well, there's a few issues. I mean, one is clearly the knight fork now is going to be pretty devastating, because I'm going to win the exchange and I'm going to end up with a rook against a knight, and there's really going to be no way of advancing this pawn up. Now, one other thing that I did think about at this point was, after this move, clearly the knight is attacking my rook. So one thing that I tried to calculate at this point was, now if I let that knight attack my rook, okay, so let's say knight takes, could I now recapture with my knight, hitting both the king and the rook? The king has to move, and would have to move to one of these squares so that it can carry on defending the rook, and then knight takes, king takes from wherever it is, and then perhaps my pawn could make progress up the board. That would very likely have worked, but instead I decided to kick the knight away from the defense of this square, and I simply win the exchange with ease. And now, pushing my pawn up the board, he grabs a pawn. It's all inconsequential, and even here with the possibility of knight to there doesn't make any difference, because I've got checks. So I can very easily get out of that with check, and there my opponent resigns. So very odd, very unusual. This f6 move, he's moved the forget about it pawn, the f pawn, on move 2, really just opening up his kingside. And how many times do you play 2 moves in a game of chess where where chess.com doesn't have any name for that opening? There's a really good reason for that. It's because it's a dumbass opening, and really from very early on, my opponent just falls apart. You know, especially with this move, dropping a pawn, and his defense for his king is nowhere. Right from the start of the game, we're on move 7 here, and he's already looking very, very vulnerable. So he's spending a lot of moves now, literally just having to respond to attacking threats, and then it really does just become quite a formality to take advantage of particularly this d-pawn, which proved to be just unstoppable towards the end of the game. So there you go. Follow opening principles, boys and girls. You know, you don't want to be on a punishing dumbass openings video at any point soon, but you know, it's a satisfying win, and you've got to be open to, if your opponent plays bizarre things like this, you just carry on. You do what you need to do, occupy the center, develop your pieces as soon as you can, and you will be very well set up to go on and win the chess game. So there you go. That is Punishing Dumbass Openings Installment 3, and I hope to be able to entertain you further with many more of these to come in the future. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I'll see you soon.